It was mid-December 1944. The war in Europe had already narrowed to a thin, bitter contest of supply and will. The Allied armies had pushed across France. The port of Antwerp lay behind the front lines as a prize both essential and vulnerable, and the Germans were closing on the last acts of a desperate plan. On the morning of December 16th, in weather that hid movement and muffled sound, German forces struck through the Ardennes forest. The shock was not simply the numbers or the tanks, it was the timing, the terrain, and the cold. Roads that were usually nothing more than country lanes became the stage for armored thrusts. The German goal was clear, bold, and risky. If they could slice through the Allied lines, seize the road network, and reach Antwerp, they might force a pause in the Allied drive. The result was a sweeping, ugly thrust that created the bulge on Allied maps and set off the most dramatic crisis the American armies had faced in the West since Normandy. In the Ardennes, there was one town that mattered more than its size would suggest, because 7 main roads met there. Bastogne was a small, grim crossroads, and control of Bastogne meant control of movement in the area. The Germans moved to take it, and the American response was to hold it at almost any cost. Units that were not armored, men who had trained for airborne operations, and the elements of armored divisions that could be diverted, came together to defend the town. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. The weather was the enemy of both sides. Low clouds and heavy snow grounded aircraft, and made resupply by air impossible. For the Americans trapped inside, the siege meant shortages of food, ammunition, winter clothing, and medicine. The worst weather of the season trapped men in foxholes, clogged engines, and froze commanders into the stark business of making impossible choices. Inside the town, the men of the 101st Airborne Division and attached units dug in. Leadership was patchwork. Senior officers were dispersed. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was acting division commander, and he would enter history over the next few days. The Germans sent an ultimatum. They demanded surrender. The reply, famously curt, was a one-word rebuke that became a symbol. McAuliffe's answer was penned, delivered, and read aloud. It was a single syllable that crystallized the mood of those cold, defiant days. That moment was not a piece of theater staged for cameras. It was a raw decision by a field commander in a town cut off and under pressure, refusing to capitulate when surrender would have been a small kindness for the German officers who wanted it. The word on the paper and the word in the mouth of a commander echoed through the lines and sustained morale. What followed was a contest between logistics and daring. The besieged men needed fuel and food and medical care. Their radio communications were strained, but they could still call for help. Higher Allied command recognized the stakes. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would not simply control crossings, they would seize momentum and threaten Antwerp and the Allied supply chain. Patton's Third Army was nearby, positioned to the south of the German breakthrough. Patton, with a reputation for speed and aggressive maneuver, was the logical man to act. His headquarters had to do what generals do, but faster and cleaner. He took the kind of risks that most commanders avoid when the map is half blank and the enemy resources are unknown. He ordered his forces to pivot, to turn axes of advance in a direction they had not been positioned for, and to push through a landscape that the Germans knew intimately. The plan required moving armored columns on thin roads, through snow and ice, with fuel limits that could make or break the mission. Patton's idea was not simply to fight through the Germans. It was to make a corridor, to smash the ring around Bastogne and reconnect the defenders with supply lines. The Third Army's movement was logistic theater. Men had to be fed, tanks had to be refueled, and maintenance had to be performed in the open. Patton was blunt about what he needed, and he expected staff officers to deliver. He prioritized routes, shifted corps, and trusted armored units to carry the weight. The spearhead that would make contact with Bastogne came from the 4th Armored Division, with the tank known in later years as Cobra King leading a small element. The armor moved on the single track of roads available, and every mile of progress meant a struggle against the elements and the enemy. The Germans did not sit idle. They tried to press outward, to close gaps, and to use the weather to blunt any relief effort. Yet the Americans were sometimes better at improvisation. Patrols scouted ruined villages, engineers cleared wrecked vehicles, and artillery fired on targets that the frozen terrain revealed only at close range. There is a human arithmetic to a relief operation. Every hour a town remains isolated, casualties mount, supplies run low, and commanders in the field are forced into raw choices. The defenders must ration, they must prioritize the wounded, and they must prepare to fight without hope of reinforcement for a time. Those small choices add up. In Bastogne, the wounded were wrapped in whatever blankets were available, and medics worked in icy basements. Radio operators kept channels open. Soldiers melted snow for water when they could. These are not dramatic scenes with grand declarations. They are the slow, steady work of survival. Their discipline bought time, and that time was necessary because the relief had to be exact and timed. Relief too early and the corridor might be cut. Relief too late, and the defenders would not be able to hold. The arithmetic always leaned on the side of the slow and steady, and the men in Bastogne measured their chances by the hours they could hold out. In leadership terms, Patton's action was decisive. He had been ordered, in a sense, to be ready to move on short notice. He became the pivot of the Allied operational response. He took the Third Army's available forces, turned 2 Corps north, and pushed them hard. The 4th Armored Division's combat command was asked to do something that would become a model of fast, bold maneuver. They were to break through the German cordon and reach the town from the southwest. The tanks would not be able to roll in a broad front. They had to find the single lane of least resistance, roll through narrow villages, and fight to the sound of skirmishes. The Armenians of maps were cold, but Patton's men warmed that cold with movement. At a tactical level, the relief depended on combined arms, speed, and momentum. At a human level, it depended on grit. The soldiers of the Third Army drove their vehicles across the country, and when the roads were blocked, they breached hedgerows, coaxed engines back to life, and pushed through snowdrifts. On December 26th, the spearhead made contact. Contact was literal. It was the touch of steel and the clearing of a route, and it gave the besieged men something harder than aid. It gave them hope. What the relief accomplished on December 26th was more than the moment when the tanks arrived. It re-established the flow of supplies, it evacuated the most severely wounded, and it allowed artillery and supporting units to operate more effectively. It also shifted the psychological balance. A force that has been dug in, that has been holding on out of stubbornness and necessity, needs evidence that the larger army still values them. The arrival of Patton's men told the 101st and the attached units that they were not forgotten. The Germans could still fight, and the broader battle was far from over, but the immediate crisis at Bastogne had been relieved. The air, which had been grounded by cloud, cleared sufficiently to allow resupply drops to be effective after the relief. That change in supply modality, from dwindling ground stores to a more reliable airborne supply chain, made a difference in the endurance of the defenders. It is worth pausing to analyze the German choices. Their plan had been audacious, and it relied on surprise, speed, and the weather. On the first days they achieved remarkable surprise. Fuel problems, logistics failures, and a lack of manpower in key reserves did the rest. German armored units that had punched through had initial success because Allied forces were thin in that sector, but the Germans failed to concentrate enough force on the true objectives. They left strong points like Bastogne in play, and those points defended stubbornly, pinned down mechanized groups that were needed elsewhere. The Germans also lacked secure supply lines. Their troops were operating at the end of long, fragile chains. As days passed, and the Americans pinned their defenses, German momentum stalled. The Allied advantages in production and in the ability to bring up reserves were factors that could not be overcome by tactical brilliance alone. Victory required more fuel and more men than the Germans could supply at that point in late 1944. The Ardennes offensive turned, in part, on a failure of logistics. Patton's relief of Bastogne is often remembered for its speed and audacity, and those are the correct words. But the relief also teaches lessons about planning, priorities, and the use of available forces. Patton's decision to pivot his army northward required both boldness and a willingness to accept risk. He understood the value of time and routes of movement. He exploited the fact that his units had trained for rapid mechanized action. He also imposed on his staff a level of discipline in maintenance, fuel planning, and route selection that transformed possibility into reality. The result was not a miracle in the mystical sense. It was a carefully executed set of operations that made maximum use of men, machines, and timing. The contact at Bastogne was the payoff for those preparations. We should not romanticize fighting. Casualties on both sides were heavy. The men who fought in bitter cold endured frostbite, exhaustion, and constant danger. Medics and aid stations were overwhelmed. Supply wagons became targets, and the fragile lifelines of men in foxholes were subject to the vicissitudes of war. There were acts of simple bravery, and there were examples of command competence that saved lives. There were also mistakes and missed opportunities on both sides. History remembers the headline moments, but the daily grind of war is where most of the human cost was measured. To understand Bastogne is to understand both the strategic calculus and the small acts that together sustained defense and allowed relief. After the relief, the fighting around Bastogne continued for weeks. The German offensive continued to sputter and then withdraw. The Allies gradually regained the ground, and the strategic outcome was eventually sealed by the limitations that German forces faced, and by the resolute defense the Americans had put up. Bastogne became a symbol, not because of a single moment, but because it combined steadfast defense under hopeless conditions, a command decision that refused to surrender, and an operational maneuver that reconnected a cut-off pocket with the main force. Those elements together made the event memorable and instructive. In the end, the story of how Patton's Third Army drove through Christmas blizzards to save the 101st at Bastogne is a story about choices. It is about the use of speed when speed matters, about the ability of commanders to prioritize, and about the ability of commanders to prioritize, and about the ability of commanders to prioritize. It is about logistics, and it is about a word written on a slip of paper that became a rallying cry. It is also about the limits of offensive plans that stretch beyond their supply. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last great gamble, and it failed because the gamble could not be sustained. The relief of Bastogne is one of the decisive moments in that failure, because it returned initiative and conveyed that the Allied armies could withstand and then reverse a serious test of their cohesion. As historians analyze the event, they point to several enduring lessons. First, terrain and logistics shape outcomes in ways that pure numbers cannot. Second, the actions of a few commanders and units can have outsized effects when they intersect with strategic vulnerabilities. Third, morale and clear communication under stress are force multipliers. And finally, the willingness to act decisively when limbs of the front are threatened can prevent a local crisis from becoming a strategic disaster. The relief of Bastogne is not merely an episode of heroism. It is a study in command, logistics, and human endurance that carries lessons for generals and for ordinary citizens who try to make sense of how wars are won or lost. When we look back at those days, we see more than snow and steel. We see the thousand small decisions made by officers and enlisted men alike. We see the limit of plans and the power of improvisation. We see the clarity of a single reply to an ultimatum. And we see the long, grinding work of engineers and mechanics who kept engines running through cold and mud. We see the steady roll of armored columns that dared to move when the map said to wait. The relief of Bastogne is a lesson in how a democracy organizes itself for war, how it applies industrial strength, and how at the smallest levels courage and ingenuity still matter. The men who were there did not ask for legend. They wanted to survive, and they wanted to do their duty. The story of Patton and the Third Army, of the 101st and their stubborn stand, is not a polished myth. It is the product of logistics, leadership, and endurance. That combination, in the cold of December 1944, made a difference. It turned a desperate moment into a victory that mattered, and it left a legacy that still teaches about the cost and craft of war.